Dust swirled across the dry, Wyoming plain as the supply wagon rolled into the settlement, its wheels creaking, its horses sweating through the long journey. And when the canvas flap lifted, a young woman climbed down carefully, her boots touching earth like she wasn't sure she was allowed to stand on it. Her name was Clara May, and she kept her head lowered, hiding behind her tangled hair as the townsfolk glanced at her with quick, murmuring judgment. Her dress was simple and faded, her hands rough from years of chores, and she carried no umbrella, no ribbon, no pretty trinket like the women who usually arrived on mail-order routes. She clutched a small cloth bundle, everything she owned, and stepped away from the wagon as if she hoped no one would notice her. But one person did. A tall cowboy, broad-shouldered, dust on his hat, steady on his boots, Elias Boone, a man known more for his silence than his words, stood near the edge of town, leaning on a post with his horse shifting patiently beside him. The moment Clara stepped down, he pushed off the post and walked toward her. Not fast, not slow, just steady. She tried not to look at him, but when he stopped in front of her, she felt his shadow. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't judging, he was just watching, like he saw something beyond the surface. Clara swallowed and whispered, almost apologizing for her existence, I'm not pretty like the others." She expected him to step back, to reconsider, to turn around like so many had done before on other roads, in other towns, in other parts of her life. But Elias just tipped his hat a little, eyes calm as river stones, and said the words that would change everything. "That's fine. I'm not looking for fancy. I need honest." His voice wasn't soft or poetic. It was real, solid, the kind that settled into someone's chest and stayed there. Clara blinked, confused, unsure if he was mocking her. But he stepped to the side and gently motioned toward his horse and the second saddlebag. He'd brought one filled with food, water, and a spare coat. He had prepared for her. Not for a pretty stranger, but for a person. As they walked out of town, Clara felt the weight of stares behind her, felt old shame tugging at her. But Elias never hurried her, never pressed her with questions, never tried to fill the silence. They traveled past golden fields, over small creeks, and through the shadow of tall pines until his small homestead appeared, a cabin in repair, a barn missing boards, a corral half finished. She felt embarrassment tug at her again, thinking he must regret choosing her, but he simply handed her water and pointed toward the porch. "You hungry?" he asked. She nodded, and in that simple exchange, Clara realized something. He wasn't expecting beauty, charm, or polished conversation. He wanted partnership, someone who wouldn't pretend, someone who would help rebuild a life that had fallen apart long before she arrived. That night, when she sat on the porch watching the sunset spill over the mountains, she felt something warm settle into her for the first time in years. Not romance, not dreams, but possibility. And as the coyotes howled and the wind brushed the grass, Clara whispered into the dusk, "Maybe I can start again." Little did she know that the hardest challenges and the deepest truths were still ahead. If you love stories like this, subscribe to the channel for more powerful Western tales that inspire courage, hope, and strength. Morning. Sun stretched across the valley when Clara awoke to the sound of hammering. She stepped outside expecting to see hired help or neighbors, but she found Elias alone, lifting heavy beams and repairing the corral as though it didn't matter if the world saw him struggle or succeed. Without thinking, she walked over, rolled up her sleeves, and began stacking lumber beside him. He didn't protest. He didn't tell her to go inside, didn't treat her like she was fragile, didn't act surprised that she was willing to work. Instead, he paused only long enough to say, "Thanks," and then they continued together in quiet rhythm. As days turned into weeks, Clara began to understand Elias's world. It wasn't polished or loud or filled with smooth-talking men and fancy dresses. It was built on sweat and patience, on long days repairing fences, on evenings drying herbs in the kitchen, on slow conversations that revealed more truth than fast ones ever could. Every day she learned something new: how to tie knots the right way, how to calm a nervous horse, how to bake bread that didn't burn on the bottom. And Elias learned from her too, how to mend clothes neatly, how to keep the ledger organized, how to make a home feel lived in instead of abandoned. But it wasn't perfect. There were evenings Clara sat alone near the creek, fighting old voices that whispered she wasn't enough, that a woman like her shouldn't hope for anything steady or safe. The past had left cracks in her heart that didn't fill easily. One night, after a long storm that washed out part of the garden, Clara finally let the weight spill out and said, "You should have chosen someone better. Someone beautiful. Someone who doesn't break so easily." Elias didn't rush to comfort her. He didn't speak over her. He just pulled his hat off, sat on the porch beside her, and let the quiet settle before answering. "Clara, life's not built by perfect folks. It's built by the ones who keep standing." Back up. His words weren't fancy, but they were strong enough to reach the deepest parts of her. Over the next months, they rebuilt the garden, repaired the roof, trained the horses, traded at the mercantile, and slowly shaped a new life, one where Clara wasn't hiding anymore. One evening, as the sun slid behind the mountains, painting the valley gold, Clara stood on the porch in a dress she had mended herself, hair braided neatly, not fancy but proud, and Elias looked at her not wide-eyed, not awestruck, but with a steady, grounded respect that made her spine straighten and her heart settle. "You did all this," he said softly, nodding toward the homestead, the corral, the life they were building, "not because you're pretty, but because you're strong." Clara felt tears rise, not from sadness, but from understanding. It had never been about being beautiful. It had been about being truthful, being willing, being brave enough to show up when life knocked her down, and standing there, watching the land glow under the dying light. Clara finally whispered something she hadn't believed in years. "Maybe I'm enough." Elias tipped his hat with a small smile. "Reckon you always were." And from that day on, Clara didn't measure her worth by mirrors or whispers. She measured it by the life she helped build, the work of her hands, the honesty in her voice, and the courage she carried every sunrise. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring more powerful, motivating frontier stories to life. Ra woke before sunrise the next morning, not because Elias had asked her to, but because something inside her refused to let her lie still when she was finally standing in a place where she wasn't treated like a burden. She stepped quietly out of the cabin into the chilly dawn, the valley wrapped in blue, mist and the mountains glowing faintly with the promise of daylight. And she breathed in air so crisp it almost hurt her lungs, but somehow made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. She noticed Elias already awake, saddling his horse with slow, practiced motions, and though he didn't say much, he nodded at her as if acknowledging that she belonged in the moment just as much as he did. She hesitated before asking if he needed help, expecting him to tell her to rest, but instead he handed her a bridle and gently pointed toward the second horse, a calm chestnut mare named Willow whose eyes were soft but cautious, as if she too had seen hard years. Clara approached carefully, whispering reassuring words the way she always had with frightened animals back home, and to her surprise Willow lowered her head, letting the bridle slip on with almost no resistance. Elias watched, not with amazement, but with the quiet look of someone who simply noticed everything. And after a moment he said, "Most folks don't earn her. Trust that fast." Clara felt warmth rise in her chest, not pride, not confidence, but something gentler, like the slow return of a voice she'd forgotten she possessed. Together they rode toward the south pasture, where a long stretch of fencing had collapsed from the recent windstorm. And though Clara had never ridden long distances before, she refused to complain, refused to show weakness, because something about working beside Elias made her want to push herself further than she normally would. When they reached the broken fence line, Elias showed her how to dig proper post holes, how to anchor beams so they wouldn't tilt, how to tie wire tight without cutting her palms, and she followed each instruction carefully, sweating under the growing heat but never stopping, not even when her arms trembled from the effort. Hours passed with nothing but the sound of wood splitting, wire clinking, horses snorting, and Clara's heartbeat thudding against her ribs. But there was something oddly peaceful about it, something grounding that made her forget the old echoes of cruelty she once carried. At midday, when she finally paused to wipe her forehead, Elias handed her a canteen and a piece of cornbread wrapped in cloth, not speaking, not fussing, just offering it like it was the most natural thing in the world. Clara ate in silence, watching birds circle above the pines in the valley stretch, endlessly toward the horizon. And the longer she sat there, the more she felt the past loosening its grip, not disappearing but shifting enough to let new breath enter her chest. When they finished repairing the fence and rode back to the homestead, tired and dusty, Elias slowed his horse and glanced at her before saying, "You worked hard today." His tone wasn't flattery or praise, but acknowledgement, real, solid acknowledgement, and Clara felt something steady settle inside her, like the first plank of a foundation being laid. She realized then that this place wasn't testing her beauty or charm or politeness. It was testing her strength, her endurance, her truth, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't failing. As the homestead came into view, glowing gold under the late afternoon sun, Clara felt a strange sense of belonging stir in her chest, something she wasn't ready to name yet but wasn't afraid of anymore. She didn't know what the future held or how many storms still waited beyond the mountains, but she knew one thing with quiet certainty. She wasn't the same girl who stepped off that wagon yesterday. Something inside her had shifted, strengthened, awakened, and though she didn't fully understand it yet, she knew this was only the beginning of a much larger journey waiting to unfold.